and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure now to transmogrify. That was a word they used in International Women's Year in 1975. And anyone remember that? Along with the Mavis Bramston show, I am clearly a baby boomer. But my next guest, Cathy Kezelman, is going to join me on stage, and I'm going to change from an MC into an interviewer. Dr. Cathy Kezelman, who joins me now, would you make her welcome? Cathy is a medical doctor who gave up her practice after the death of a close relative triggered traumatic memories of childhood sexual abuse and led to great emotional and physical distress. And what Cathy has agreed to do is to talk about her keys to recovery and resilience in an extremely tight time frame, in a public space, with a screen that will say stop, stop, stop after 20 minutes. So will you please acknowledge her emotional courage in this exercise? Cathy is president of ASCA, Adult Surviving Child Abuse, and she's written her story in Innocence Revisited, A Tale in Two Parts. And Cathy's also a mother of four, and I welcome two of her four adult children who are with us today. I want to focus in this limited time we have, and we aren't sitting this far apart because she's a medical practitioner who lacks communication skills. We've met so many who clearly have them in this room. We've been asked to sit this far apart for filming purposes, so I just wanted to explain that. But we're going to focus almost exclusively on what helped. But to get a sense of the scale of the dilemma that you were dealing with, you had waves of memory over quite an extended period of time that caused a big physical as well as a very traumatic mental and emotional response. Can you give us a sense of the impact of these memories on your well-being?
Well, when my niece was killed suddenly, I obviously grieved, as everyone does, but then other members of my family were starting to get on with their lives, and I really developed very profound anxiety, started to have panic attacks, and slipped into a very deep depression. And soon after that, I started to get flashbacks, and being a well-trained medico, I had no idea what they were. I'd never actually heard of them. But what happened to me at the time, I was 45, and I'd be suddenly thrown back from being a 45-year-old mother of four to being a 4-year-old child and experiencing sensations, movements, and abject terror without actually knowing what was going on. So I didn't actually have a context or a narrative for it, but I had these experiences.
And Cathy, over what length of time did new memories of new abuse by family members and others occur?
Well, that came and went over, probably 5-6 years. I mean, it became apparent that I actually had virtually no memory for about 10 years of my childhood, and I'd always dismissed that. And of course, I didn't know what the significance of that was, that can often mean fairly substantial trauma for the period of the amnesia.
When we met before we joined you today to talk about how we'd approach this, Cathy said to me, "I'm no longer controlled by the issue or consumed with fury." Now, when you read her book, you will see what a remarkable comment that is. Your therapist, I think a clinical psychologist, yes, was the key to your recovery. What did she do right?
She did a lot of things right. I mean, firstly, what she provided for me was a relationship of trust, and having been betrayed so badly in my childhood, it took me a heck of a long time to trust her. She also provided me with a safe space where really anything could be spoken about. I actually brought the unspeakable to her, and she sat by empathically, she listened, she validated, and that was probably the first time that I was ever really heard in that way. And together we actually came to make meaning of a history that had been hidden to me as well. So not only did I find out what had happened to him as a child, but I could also make sense of it. And of course, if you don't know where you've come from and what your past is, you don't know who you are. So it actually helped me to form my sense of self and my identity.
Tell me about finding meaning. What sort of meaning?
Really, over the process, I changed enormously. I could see you know, a lot of my validation was around seeing the change in myself and understanding my reactions and behaviours in the past. And so I made sense of why I had behaved certain ways, what my coping strategies had been, why I wasn't as emotionally engaged as I might have been. And over time, I learnt to be more connected and have deeper and stronger relationships because I got in touch with myself as well.
Let's just talk a little bit about time. You've indicated that the memories came back over time. But you've also said in the book, the slower you go, the faster you get there. I know we have many people who work as therapists here, as well as probably people who attend therapists. Tell me about time.
Well, in the midst of my recovery, I was very easily triggered, for want of a better word. There were lots of things that could make me emotionally react or send me back into a very dissociative space. So switched off into that childhood space so that actually what happened was that the present would actually disappear altogether. I was actually living in the past. I was batting away the trauma of the past continually. It was very hard for me to get in touch with the present, let alone engage with the future.
And when you say you were caught up in the now of the memory, you would physically go into the fetal position.
Yeah, I'd actually relive whatever was happening. But of course, you know, I had the memories of a child. I didn't have meaning around it. And as I say, the way traumatic memory is stored, you don't actually have a chronology or a narrative. So you have memories, but you can't make sense of them. You can't put them where they belong.
It's my understanding that one of the things you want people to really think about, particularly if they're professionals working with people who've experienced abuse, is trauma-informed practice. Just explain what you mean by that.
Well, I'm medically trained. I was trained as a GP, and I learnt about symptoms, signs, diagnoses and pathology. When I was in the midst of what was going on with me, I would have probably had about 8 to 10 diagnoses. And obviously, if anyone has 8 to 10 diagnoses, there's something wrong with that. So that's a biological model of diagnosis. But really, a lot of what was going on for me was as a result of what I'd experienced. So it's about understanding people in the context of their lived experience. Why had I developed certain coping strategies? What had been the impacts of what I'd undergone? Because had other people experienced my trauma, they also probably would have had those reactions.
One of the things that I found challenging, confronting about your book, towards the end of the book, I'd call it a reflective chapter. It almost reads as if you've written it later. And the book is full of graphic depictions of your memories of abuse. And these are some selections from the book which I indicated to Cathy I would read here and ask her about them. After a long search for irrefutable validation for my memories, I relinquished the search for concrete proof and accepted that my therapists bearing witness to my experiences in sessions provided validation in itself. And later, some events might not have happened. Some may represent a metaphor for events rather than an accurate depiction, and some may be a conglomeration of a number of events. Now, clearly, recovering memories over time has received some very critical discussion. Some of your memories appear to be almost a cult-like group abuse of you as a young woman. The impression I got from your book was that you were saying what my therapist did right was not to obsess about the actual verification of each event, but rather to give you empathic listening as a tool for recovery. Could you talk a little about that?
Yes, well, I suppose the essence of this is that a therapeutic space is not a court of law. It's not about proving, beyond reasonable doubt that this happened. It's about being with a person, walking alongside them and hearing their truth, their reality, and working with whatever came into that room. And that there were times when I had different ages presenting and, my therapist responded to those different ages appropriately, and each of those different age presentations were heard and listened to and validated. So again, it was about building trust in that relationship. It was about being heard for the very first time.
Would you go so far as to say to people who work with adult survivors of abuse who have traumatic memories that the actual accuracy of their memory doesn't matter?
Look, I mean, obviously it matters to some degree, but I think in that process it's not, definitely by far not the most significant issue. The most significant issue is that relationship of trust, feeling safe, having firm boundaries, feeling heard.
I suppose, I'm aware you have two of your adult children in the room, but I don't know if they've read the book, but if they ever read the book, if I was a child, I guess I'd want to know, did that happen to my mother? Because it involves accusations against relatives of theirs as well, including your father.
Well, obviously, but there's a reality with what can be proven and what can't be proven, and at some point you need to give that search up and accept that this is what I know. But more important to me was knowing who I am and knowing the change in myself, that now I am a much more connected person. And for the first time, I actually realised that I can actually have my own thoughts and feelings and choices. That may sound absurd to some people, but for a long time, I wasn't aware of that. And I can now embrace a future and embrace hope and resilience.
And with the organisation Adults Surviving Child Abuse, is it that kind of unconditional acceptance that is a key to what you can offer individuals who've experienced abuse? I know you work with professionals as well.
Well, I think for all survivors it's about being heard and being listened to, and overcoming that sense of shame and self-blame that children take on when they're abused, and that often continues very inappropriately into adult life. But we still have a society, very sadly, that stigmatises the whole issue of abuse, and we hear all the time from people ringing our 1300 line about people telling them to just get over it, get on with it. Yes, over time you can come to understand it, and it will always be a part of you, and it will stop ruling you, but it's not as simple as just getting on with it and getting over it. You have to process it and you have to come to terms with it.
Tell us about your husband and children, because I had the sense that their support was almost as influential on your recovery as your therapist.
Look, obviously very critical to have a family there and close friends, and sadly a lot of survivors don't have that. A lot of survivors are very isolated, because when you are a child who's been abused, you're very alone, and it's very easy to go back into that childhood space of being alone. So I was really very fortunate to have that support, and as you say, to have a family who was there for me. But obviously they've gone through their own process, and together as a family we've gone through obviously an enormously challenging process.
Your mother was a very different experience, and you talk a lot about your mother and the fact that she's a Holocaust survivor and a survivor of trauma herself.
Yes.
What was the hardest thing about your mother's reaction to what you were saying about your father and your other experiences?
Look, it's obviously very difficult, because my mother's experience is an experience that is unimaginable. I mean, she's suffered unimaginable trauma, and I understand that. But for me as a child, it was very difficult, because she was unable to be there for me. She was unable to be empathic. And similarly in my recovery, she was also unable to validate. She didn't validate. She was not there for me. So that was really the same story, and at some point I had to accept that would never change. She is a product of what happened to her, as I am, and that's how it is. As someone said to me, and it was probably a very valuable thing, your mother is blind in that way, and you're sitting around waiting for her to see it's not going to happen. And like any child, you hope that your parents will be there, and as an adult child you also hope that at some point you do have to let go of it.
You come across now, Cathy, as so rational and so calm, and the book
I did pay a lot for therapy.
Well, indeed. But where has the fury gone? I mean that really seriously. I mean, anger can be such a debilitating emotion.
There was a period where I did, and don't leave the room, I did understand homicidal rage. I really did, because the fury was just so intense. But as I say, I have worked through it. I do understand. I mean, I don't think you can ever understand really why someone abuses, but I understand it to the best of my ability, and I have been able to let go of that rage and move on.
In a way, that throwaway line about investing in therapy, it's not funny at one level, is it? Only in the sense that those of us who've benefited from really good quality talking and listening therapies know that time is important, and it can cost a lot, even with private health insurance. There's a gap.
Yes, yeah.
And is it one of the great inequities that you must face in your work with
Absolutely.
adults surviving child abuse, that people must come to you who cannot afford that.
And I've been very privileged in that way, which is why I do the work I do, because I have been privileged with the resources to get a lot of therapy, with an education, with the ability now to be able to speak and talk, where, you know, a lot of survivors don't have the voice, don't have the capacity, don't have the support. And one thing our organisation is doing is really talking to government about trauma, because even with, you know, the supposed mental health reforms that are proposed, there's still not any provision for addressing people who've experienced what we call complex trauma, the trauma of childhood abuse, because when you're abused in those crucial developmental stages of childhood, it can potentially affect, you know, lots of aspects of your development and your functioning. But the good news is that we know that people can and do recover. The brain science that people have been talking about, we know that people can get better, but we need the services, and the government is still not on board with that.
Some of you will have seen media coverage over the last 48 hours about an inquiry into the child protection system in Victoria, with estimates that 1 in 4 of children born this week will be the subject of a notification if the current rate of notification of concern for abuse continues. I mean, it's almost an impossible piece of information to take on board, but a Supreme Court judge and a woman called Dorothy Scott, and a very experienced social worker who's internationally renowned for her work in child protection, were part of the board that made that finding. Why I raise this is, even as I read your book, there was a part of me that didn't want to know. I'm an ambassador for an organisation that's about child abuse, but it is awful in the full meaning of that word. It is very hard to actually delve into this and understand the incidence and the severity of some individual experiences such as your own. What can we do about that almost visceral desire to go la, 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 la?
Yeah, look, I mean, all we need to do is look at the prevalence of it. I mean, we know that there are over more than 2 million adults who've experienced some form of abuse and neglect, and still we have this collective denial and stigma. It's about us all understanding and overcoming that gut reaction, that fear, overcoming the ignorance, and learning that, you know, we need to be there as human beings to support one another. Children are vulnerable, they're inherently vulnerable, and yet, you know, there are some people who take advantage of that vulnerability. All human beings can be vulnerable, we're all the same, so we just need to be there to understand, to reach out and to support one another.
We have a moment left. Just tell us what adults surviving child abuse, what do you do? What forums do you run? And if people wish to get information or support?
Yes, look, we run a 1300 line where people can ring up and talk to one of our therapists for support. We run workshops for survivors, training programs for health professionals around trauma-informed care and how to really listen to their clients and understand how to respond. We also advocate on a very big scale with government. So our website's aska.org.au, and you're welcome to donate anytime.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by thanking Cathy's 2 children who are here supporting their mum today, and I ask you also to thank Dr. Cathy Kezelman.
Thank you.